So again, for those who are just coming in, help yourself to food and beverages, and we're going to move right into the second panel now. And our faculty panelists will be Professor Ken Conca from Global Environmental Policy, or is it Politics? It's both. Professor Michael Schroeder and Professor William Belding. And our first, oh sorry, that's our third panel. I apologize. Professor Conca is on our second panel, as well as Professor Abdul Aziz Saeed from International Peace and Conflict Resolution. So our first presenter on this panel is Livia. She is a second-year Ethics, Peace, and Global Affairs student, and she's going to be talking about Indigenous democracy and peacebuilding in Bolivia. And I'm just going to remind our student presenters, if you could try to keep your comments to 15 minutes, that will just give us more time during the Q&A. So, so John and I aren't trying to be obnoxious up here in the first row. So thank you, Livia.
Well, okay. Do I need a mic? All right, so I'm presenting my thesis research as Jason did, and I think it fits in very well with the comments that were just presented about indigenous peoples being the opposition, because I analyzed Bolivia, where the indigenous peoples' opposition was able to claim the power of their country and currently is governed by an indigenous president. So the title of my thesis is Radical Bolivia, a discourse analysis of Bolivia's indigenous democracy. So I am critically analyzing what it exactly means, this indigenous democracy that is currently in place in Bolivia. Oh. Sorry. Okay. So, like I said, since 2005, Bolivia has its first indigenous president, Evo Morales, and you see him on this picture. His social movement party, the MAS, holds majority political power in the government, and they claim that finally the people are in power because Bolivia is to 64% indigenous, making it the largest indigenous population in a nation in the world. However, when you look at reality, it's not just him wearing indigenous clothing and respecting traditions, but instead you still, since he got elected, have a lot of protests, mobilizations, social unrests. So where you have a lot of indigenous people, like you see with the features, they are clearly of indigenous ethnicities protesting against the current government. So my research question is, what explains the continued occurrence of social upheavals by Bolivian people under the leadership of their democratically elected indigenous president, Evo Morales, and his indigenous-dominated party, the MAS? To investigate this question, I chose an interpretivist epistemology. Similar to Jason, I did a discourse analysis where I claim that both democracy and an indigenous identity are discursively constructed social constructs, and therefore their relationship needs to be examined for the democracy in place to be legitimate. My methodology, really briefly, I'm not going to go too much into that to show you what I actually found in my discourse analysis, but I chose to analyze oneself and one other. What I mean with that, I analyzed the official discourse where Evo Morales and his government communicate that Bolivia currently has a radical indigenous self that is in opposition to a neoliberal imperialist other that was previously in place. Then obviously I chose to analyze the official discourse that is communicated by the government, but also the marginalized discourses of indigenous organizations and Bolivian academia, as well as the common Bolivian people, because I claim if you want a radical indigenous democracy to be in place, you have to listen to the voices also of those usually not included. Then for the The time frame that I chose to analyze is Bolivia's indigenous democracy since it is in existence, so December 2005 until today. And the number of events I analyzed, I claim it's one event, this indigenous democracy being in place, but I subdivided it into 6 smaller events, such as the election of Morales and the passing of the constitutional reform, and other similar events. And I went to do field research for 3 months this summer or winter, if you take it from the Bolivian perspective, of 3 months to see an event over a larger time frame where you have nothing major happening, but more the daily life to analyze. For the official discourse, I chose speeches and texts delivered by Evo Morales and high-ranking government officials. So those were primary sources. And for the marginalized discourses, for the indigenous organizations and Bolivian academics, you chose 3 organizations and their communication materials, in specific their plans of actions. And those organizations are the CDOP, the CONAMAC, and the CSUTCB. CDOP is in the lowland indigenous organization, the CONAMAC is the highland indigenous organization, and the CSUTCB is the largest campesino organization. So they're the largest representatives of indigenous peoples currently in civil society. And for the Bolivian academics, I chose scholarly work of the 6 most popular, most famous academics that are locally writing about the indigenous democracy. For the people, I conducted 14 unstructured interviews with common people that I met in public plazas in 2 cities, Santa Cruz in the lowlands and Potosi in the highlands, and I conducted 54 days of ethnographic observations. And this information I then analyzed through a 3-staged coding process. And these are the themes that I found. On the left, you see the official discourse, middle, the marginalized discourse of indigenous organizations and local academics, and on the right of the common Bolivian people. The official discourse says very, very prevalently that colonialism is the evil force that they're fighting against. And colonialism they define not just as colonial times, but even neoliberalism. The US today continues to be a colonialist force that threatens Bolivia and its indigenous identity. So from that, you go into the second theme of them now, under Evo Morales and Mas, embracing their indigenous self, and they incorporate indigenous norms, traditions, the language, etc., into the government for it to be representative of that. Furthermore, they say that the radical indigenous democracy gives power to the people. Finally, the people are the ones who decide what should be done, and their well-being stands at the center of everything. They're transforming what democracy means from a Western model to an alternative Southern indigenous model, and with that, create a model for the rest of the world to replicate, hopefully. Now, the other 2 marginalized discourses see Bolivia's indigenous democracy a bit different. You have the indigenous organizations and local academics who also say that the memory of oppression through the West is very prevalent. So they're similar, but the common Bolivian people say, no, the other is not the memory of repression or the West, but instead it's corrupt and self-serving politicians that have failed the country, that have taken their powerful positions to line their own pockets. Going off of that, you have the indigenous organizations saying that the self is an indigenous Bolivia, but that is the plurinational indigenous Bolivia. So not only recognizing the officially recognized indigenous populations of Quechua and Aymara, who are the most dominant ones, but going down to the community level where you can self-identify with certain tribes that you don't need official recognition for, and all of them together make up the indigenous self. The marginalized discourse of the common people, because they don't see their self, or the other as the imperialist evil, their self is also different, and instead of seeing themselves as indigenous, they say they're simply different and they're still very impoverished. So they would like to overcome that, but they never articulate an indigenous identity as being central to themselves. Different to the official discourse that says power to the people is most important, the indigenous organizations say autonomy for the indigenous communities is very important, while the common people say, well, we have no support whatsoever, so we are the ones who are important because we have to help ourselves. Because of that, the official discourse claims that transformed democracy is actually occurring and is a success, but the indigenous organizations say the transformation is incomplete, while the common Bolivian people say that the misery continues. So you see, there are quite stark differences. I'm not going to go into the last one because I'm going to show here how this causes conflict. So if you have the self being identified this differently, you have potential for conflict, I claim. If the current government creates institutions, policies, etc., based in an indigenous self that only embraces the Quechua and Aymara people, you have the civil society organizations who see the plurinational indigenous as the correct indigenous identity of the country as not being represented in those policies, in those institutions. So they demand from the government that that is been put in place. While the common Bolivian people who see themselves as socially disadvantaged and refuse this indigenous image to be put on themselves because they identify it as being underdeveloped, reject this completely. So if you have a president telling them that they have to dress in indigenous fashion, they say, no, we don't want to because we don't want to be identified as the Indio with the llama. So you have there a very stark contrast between how they see themselves and how then also they see the other. If you have the self for both the official and the discourse and the discourse of the organizations and academics, it's the West against whom you have to fight. So you have to isolate Bolivia from it. But the people see the politicians as the other that they have to fight. So how do they trust a government that is still using the traditional political process to make policies, to change their country, if they have no trust whatsoever? So another great potential for conflict that has been playing out. In addition, how to achieve change is viewed very differently. The official discourse, the government says, well, the government has to give the power to the people. They have to be the primary actor. The indigenous organizations and local academics say, well, it has to be this autonomy through the communitarian model within the radical democracy that has to be the method of achieving this change, while the common Bolivian people say, no, we don't trust any of you, we have to do it ourselves. So again, great potential for conflict. Clearly, because of this different view of the radical indigenous Bolivia today, you have a different evaluation of Bolivia. The official discourse claims Bolivia has been a successful transformation. You have a model in place that can be replicated. But if you see the indigenous self differently, your construction of the other differently, the current institutions do not reflect that. So the Bolivian indigenous organizations say, well, we have some changes, the constitutional change, etc., has been some achievement, but it's still incomplete because we don't have the autonomy in place that we actually need for this change to be implemented. While the common Bolivian people who do not believe in this construction of self and other at all say, well, there's no change whatsoever because we still suffer under miserable conditions, and it's the politicians who call the shots and we're the ones who have nothing to eat. Because of that, they also attribute different meanings to Bolivia. You have the official discourse who sees Bolivia as the leader of an alternative development for the rest of the world and wants Bolivia to have this really powerful position. But you have indigenous organizations who say, no, no, we're not the only ones, but we are part of a larger global movement that brings an alternative development model forward with Brazil, but also with Arab Spring countries. So we are just part of something that will inevitably happen, that cannot be stopped, but that needs more time to actually implement. While then the common Bolivian people say, well, this is just a farce. You have another imposter who now dresses differently, who claims to have a different identity, but who still steals our resources, who still lets us suffer from hunger. So why should we support that government? And then finally, I think a lot of it comes down to how you focus your analysis. The government, because it works as a government, looks at the formal changes that it enacts, and it sees its top-down changes that have been achieved as indicators for success, as indicators for Bolivia to actually be indigenous. So they passed, for example, a law that allows for disabled people to collect benefits, the first time in Bolivia ever, because the indigenous self allows for a more holistic perspective and wants the well-being of the people to be enforced. So they think, great, what we do. But then you have the civil society perspective, who look at the civil society level and say, well, it's great that you enacted that law, but it's not sufficient. So we want more. So when the government says we did well, the civil society organizations say, well, you need to do more. But then you have the people, in addition, who still are the ones who have not seen the change at their personal, private sphere level and say, what are you claiming to have changed anything for me? My child who has disability still has no improvement of its condition whatsoever. So you have those changes or those differences always being reflected and giving rise to a lot of conflict. And in a lot of demonstrations, the example that I just used was a large-scale demonstration 6 months ago in La Paz, where the people demonstrated against this law because it didn't go far enough, but the negotiations didn't go anywhere because the government claimed, well, what do you want? At least we did something. It was a first step. So you have there a communication that doesn't seem to fit together, at least discourses that don't seem to fit together. So my conclusion from this research is that the different groups in Bolivia have different identities. And for a radical indigenous democracy to be seen as legitimate by all people, their different identities need to be incorporated in that democracy. So if you still have different identities being in place that are not translating into being seen as at least included or acknowledged in the institutions, in the policies, in the programs, you will have social unrest that continue to incur. And especially because this government is the result of an indigenous social movement. They fought together to remove the previous government in place, but the previous government was able to embody the other from all three constituencies. So you had the imperialist other, but you also had the self-serving politician against whom they fought. But once this other was gone, they wanted to see their self reflected in the government, which is where the conflict started to emerge again, because you had only one representative constituency being the one in place of designing and governing the country. So this will lead to conflict, and I claim it will continue to lead to conflict until this is taken into consideration. And you can also see that currently the identities in Bolivia are constructed in a way that they're very self-serving and self-interested. So every constituency constructs an identity where they see their own people being the most important ones. So if the common people say you have to use self-help to arrive at the change, it's themselves who bring along the change. If the government says, well, you have to have the government to implement change, it's the politicians who have the most important roles in that process. Based on those conclusions, I make the following recommendations. I think inclusiveness is very important, crucial for the legitimacy of a radical democracy. I would suggest that representatives of all different constituencies are part of the process of institution and policy building from the very beginning, but you keep them as permanent representatives because identities can change, and if that change is integrated in the process, you can account for those changes. And by including the different identities, you also have dialogue emerging among the different constituencies, and they can better understand each other, which entails the possibility for a cooperative identity construction that is less self-centered and self-beneficial. And for my last recommendation, I would suggest also a direct link, a direct relationship to be established with the common citizens, not just with civil society, so that the people feel and become empowered because they can articulate their realities to the government, and the government can legitimate its radical democracy further because they can explain why they do the things that they do and that people actually understand.
Thank you, Livia. That was excellent. Following on that, we will hear from Greg, who is a first-year GEP student. He's going to talk about climate change and terrorism.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to kind of be piggybacking with Joe Thwaites a bit, who's going to be presenting after me. There is a lot of debate going on right now about whether or not climate change is in fact a security issue. And even people who think that it is are not necessarily sure that framing it as one is the best approach to take to gain significant action towards combating climate change. So what I'm going to talk about is one way that climate change could potentially manifest itself as a security issue, and then Joe is going to follow that up and talk about how if we do think about it as a security issue, what those sorts of conversations and actions would look like at the UN level. So obviously there's a lot of research out there about the potential negative effects that climate change could have. The damages to our natural systems, social upheaval, droughts, sea level rise, we all kind of know about that. And there's also a lot of research out there about how climate change could potentially lead to conflict between states or, say, large factions of society, resource wars, if you will. A lot of people frame the Darfur conflict, for example, as a water issue that is arising because of a drought resulting from climate change. What there is not a lot of research on, and what is just kind of starting to gain attention right now, is the impact that climate change could potentially have on terrorism. And living in a post-9/11 world where terrorism is such a constant focus of our news cycle, of our attention throughout the world, I thought that was kind of a curious omission. Terrorism is certainly something that has not faded from public consciousness in this country. We hear about drones and targeted killings and things of that nature every day on the news here. So I took a look at what are the risk factors associated with terrorism. I mean, conflict is an extremely poorly understood social phenomenon, and then when you add terrorism on top of that, that adds a whole entirely different complicating layer to it. You can't say that condition X exists in a place, therefore the outcome will be Y. There are no root causes to this, but what research has shown is that there are risk factors associated with terrorism. There are a set of social conditions that if they are present in a certain area, it leads to an increased risk of heightened terrorist activity. So I'm going to run through what those risk factors are. Then I'm going to talk about how climate change could potentially amplify such risk factors. And then I'm going to take a look at how all of that information can come together in a country like Bangladesh, which many security experts are predicting right now is a country where we could see this happening in the near future. So the first risk factor that research identifies is poverty, which is sort of obvious on its face. High unemployment and falling GDP were prominent in places such as Saudi Arabia, Algeria, Uzbekistan prior to the rises of terrorist movements in those countries. And many security experts say that Al-Qaeda seized on people's desperation as a recruitment tool. However, that can't be the only explanation. There are obvious exceptions to this example. For example, Osama bin Laden comes from a vast family fortune. His top deputy is trained as a doctor. And terrorist organizations often seem to show this hierarchy where the leadership tends to be wealthy and educated, and then they recruit from the so-called poor masses of society to do the dirty work. So we have to look a little further. So urbanization is another risk factor that is often associated with this. People are forced away for a variety of reasons, from traditional rural, agricultural, perhaps lifestyles, into cities to find work, or for whatever reason. And they're often faced with decrepit living conditions, slums, where they become prone to radicalization. Exclusion and social inequality are also important factors. Denial of services can cause a sense of hardened group identity that leaves people distrustful of government, which in conjunction with poverty and poor living conditions can lead them to turn to radicalism or acts of violence. And then dispossession and population displacement generally are also huge factors. As we see, refugees often face human rights abuses, alienation, humiliation when they're forced from their homes. For example, author Nasra Hassan, writing for The New Yorker, interviewed 250 people that were active in a radical Palestinian terrorist movement, and over half of them were fairly well educated, came from middle class backgrounds, but they were people who had lost their land and in turn turned to radical behavior. And finally, failed states are another important example to consider. As we've seen in places like Afghanistan, Somalia, this is an important problem. A lack of law enforcement or any kind of oversight provides a structure where terrorist organizations can flourish. They can increase their capacity, they can recruit, they can build their infrastructure with little to no impediment. And then clashes of values and demographic transitions are also factors, but because they're unlikely to be affected by climate change, I'm not going to really discuss them here, but they're just something we should know about. So how is climate change likely to amplify these? Once again, this is sort of obvious on its face. So much of the developing world focuses on agriculture for both their livelihood or for subsistence. So when we talk about increasing flooding, increasing droughts, declining soil fertility, this is going to disrupt the lifestyles of millions upon millions of people throughout the developing world. It's going to increase poverty. They're going to lose their livelihoods. Furthermore, people that live, say, in coastal communities that are prone to sea level rise, there are also people that are going to have to move that may be losing their lifestyle, their livelihoods. And then inequality and population displacement are also likely to further increase. Areas receiving incoming climate migrants might not necessarily react very well towards them. In the developing world, there's scarce resources that people are constantly competing for, whether it be jobs, housing, education, government services. And as we increase population densities, as people move, they're very likely to find the areas that they're moving to hostile towards increasing competition over these services. And then finally, least developed countries, other developing countries, there is a significant chance that they could see a rise in state failure. Dealing with things such as soil degradation, migrating populations, lack of fresh water, these are all very expensive things to undertake. And for places that already lack significant financial and intellectual capital, they might not have the resources to deal with these things. This also additionally takes already tight resources away from education, economic stimulation, infrastructure, areas that have shown that when they are invested in, they actually decrease the risk of terrorist activity. So not only are they struggling to provide for their population more than they already are, they're also taking away from areas that have been shown to reduce this problem in the first place. And then just to kind of put some numbers to these things, already 900 million people throughout the world live in slum-like conditions, and that's a number that's expected to rise by 2 billion by 2020. in India, for example, where many people depend on agriculture for their livelihoods, climate change is expected to cause a 15 to 28% decrease in agricultural yields. Since 1975, 1.5 billion people have already been affected by flood or drought worldwide. So as these things continue to increase in the coming years, and as world population continues to increase, it's kind of unimaginable how many more people are going to be affected by this. Likewise, coastal populations are also expected to see a huge increase, and they're another population that's going to be very vulnerable to the worst effects of climate change. And then states with high levels of human suffering are 2.3 times more likely to fail, according to the CIA State Failure Task Force. So as general living conditions worsen and social upheaval increases, again, we are likely to see a potential rise in state failure. So how does this all come together in Bangladesh? As I mentioned, this is an area that is particularly worrisome for many security experts. Just some background on it. Went too far. Bangladesh is the 7th most populous country in the world right now. It has about 140 million people, and that number is expected to increase by as many as 100 million by 2050. It's a very densely populated country with over 1,200 people per square kilometer, and studies have shown that densely populated areas are more vulnerable to climate change than other areas. And it's a country that is extremely vulnerable to climate change. 17.5% of its landmass could be permanently lost under climate change's worst predictions due to sea level rise. The entire country, more or less, is made up of river deltas that see extreme flooding during weather-related events. So not only are they getting hit with flooding from sea level rise, they're also getting it from the network of rivers that basically make up their entire country. On top of that, the Bay of Bengal sees the world's worst hurricanes and tsunamis. 9 of the 13 most powerful ones on record took place in the Bay of Bengal, and those are storms that are expected to increase in intensity in the future as well. And then from a financial and intellectual capital standpoint, they have a per capita income of less than $600 per year. They only have 51 scientists and engineers per million people. So when it comes to dealing with these large infrastructure-related projects, they have a significant problem. It ranks in the lower third of Transparency International's corruption index. So government services, their government services are poor and struggle to meet the country's needs, as is right now, before these negative aspects of climate change continue to advance further. So 30 million people, 30% of the population could be prone to severe, 30% of the country could see severe flooding under the worst scenarios, and 20 million people could be displaced. Furthermore, many of the areas that are most vulnerable to climate change and sea level rise in Bangladesh are right along the Indian border, and there is intense hostility towards migration from Bangladesh in India right now. In fact, India is currently constructing a border fence, much like what we have along the U.S. and Mexico right now, to help stop illegal immigration. And there are very strong anti-immigrant feelings in India in that area. For example, the only way that a Bangladeshi immigrant can become an Indian citizen is to marry another Indian citizen right now. So what we're faced with is a country that is not going to be able to adapt to climate change, a country that is going to be extremely negatively affected by it, with many people losing their livelihoods. 25% of Bangladesh depends on agriculture to generate its GDP. Flooding is going to cause huge problems with that. And in addition, their freshwater resources are being damaged because of saltwater intrusion. So we have people losing their homes, we have people losing their livelihoods, and we have a government that can't adapt to it in a situation where many of these people are not going to have anywhere to go in the first place. And that basically is the reason that many security experts look at this as such a potentially problematic area moving forward.
Thanks very much, Greg. And following up on that, Joe, who's also in the GEP program, will be presenting on climate change, human security, and international action. So thank you.
Can you use this one on?
Oh, you can use that one, sure.
Okay. Well, thank you, Tara, and thank you also, Greg, for setting up the broad area of climate and security. That's really saved me a lot of talking, so that's good. But I'm going to pick this up and look at how one institution in particular, the UN Security Council, has approached the problem. They've incorporated a variety of different perspectives on what climate and security is. So first of all, what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce a timeline of the Council meetings on climate change. And then I'm going to analyse the dynamics across these different debates. And I use the case of Pakistan to illustrate how some countries have really shifted their position over the last 6 years throughout these 3 debates that have happened so far. And then I will conclude by looking at at how the Security Council dynamics fit in with the wider international efforts to address climate change. So first of all, the first Security Council meeting on climate change took place in April 2007, and it was an initiative of the UK who held the rotating monthly presidency. So the Security Council has 15 members, 5 of whom are permanent, but all 15 rotate, and they each get a month to preside over the Council. And during that month, they can sort of shape the agenda somewhat. Obviously, there are a number of issues that the Council had no choice but to address. But then there are others where they can host thematic debates, and this is what happened here. The UK decided they wanted to have a debate on climate and energy. And what they did was they had this focus on the concept of environmental conflict. And Greg alluded to this before, but this is basically the idea that environmental change can exacerbate the underlying factors that may lead to violent conflict. And you see this in the UK's concept note. They focused on border disputes, migration, resource shortages, societal stress, and humanitarian crises. And so you really see this focus on how climate change may lead to outright war and violence. And it was a very well attended debate. You got 55 states, so way more than just the actual council membership that spoke. And 6 countries sent their ministers. The Secretary General attended. But in spite of this, they weren't able to agree any kind of formal outcome. And this was due to divisions, which I'll discuss later when we go over the broad dynamics. The second debate happened in 2011, in July, and this was the German presidency. And what was really interesting here was that there was a real shift from this violent conflict type focus to human security. And this really ties in with what David Bosco was saying. With over time, you see they're starting to look less at the interstate violence and more at like intrastate issues. And this broader concept of human security included things the Germans emphasised: sea level rise and food insecurity arising from climate change, and how that is going to exacerbate existing vulnerabilities. And again, lots of states participated. The president of Nauru, which is one of the small island states really threatened by climate change and sea level rise, attended. The Secretary General again turned up, and the director of the UN Environment Programme. And this time they were able to agree a presidential statement. Now, what these are, they're not resolutions, so they're not the ones that you hear about where they impose sanctions or something. But presidential statements are still quite important because they give a sort of signal. All the member states have to agree, and at one point it wasn't sure that they were going to be able to agree one, but eventually they did. And the presidential statement expressed, and I quote, "concern that possible adverse effects of climate change may, in the long run, aggravate certain existing threats to international peace and security." And that's kind of fairly hedged language, but it reflected a delicate compromise. And the fact that they had a statement at all is really an advance from 2007. It also requested contextual information on the possible influence of climate change on conflicts. They asked the Secretary General, when he produces regular reports on all the conflict situations that are on the Council's agenda, to start to include this such contextual information. And that, again, is a really interesting step forward. We've not really seen it very much yet, and that's an area that I want to look into in the future, is how well that's been incorporated. Then the most recent debate actually happened just last month, on the 15th of February, and it was convened by Pakistan and the UK. So this is the first time a developing country has been involved in convening the debate. And it was an ARIA formula, and this is named after a Venezuelan diplomat from the early 90s. And he conceived these debates as very informal ones, so they take place very much off the record. There are no minutes or anything, and it's away from the media spotlight of the official council debates. So you're not going to get any resolutions, you're not even going to get any presidential statements coming out of it. But it is a more flexible format, so it enables the council to be briefed by NGOs, for example. And what we saw was NGOs such as Oxfam and Climate Action Network were actually able to go and speak in front of the Security Council, which is a really sort of rare opportunity for them. And you also have a minister from the Marshall Islands. So you're already seeing this trend of the small island states are really putting a lot of effort into these debates and really making themselves visible whenever they happen. And the Vice President of the World Bank also turned up. The other thing that's really interesting from this most recent debate is the concept note has sort of brought together both the human security and the violent conflict strands, so from the previous two debates. And you see this convergence, and I think that's a really interesting thing we're seeing. So they're saying, yes, conflicts, actual interstate conflicts may happen, but also the human security aspect. And so, you know, I think that also reflects the two different hosts, Pakistan and the UK. So that's the broad timeline. Now, some of the key dynamics. Syndico has identified three different approaches behind countries who've really been pushing these discussions on climate within the Security Council. Now, the first one is just to raise the profile of climate change. And you know, the Security Council is arguably the most powerful UN body in terms of what it can do. It can pass sanctions, it can, which can be economic but also military. It's the area of the UN that has real teeth. And so anything that gets discussed there really does capture a lot of attention, both from other states and from the world's media. And this was really behind the UK pushing it in 2007. They just wanted to get people talking a lot more about climate change. The second idea is conflict prevention, and this is something that Germany and France have really taken forward. And they argue that because the Council has a mandate, certainly over the last 2 decades, the Council's mandate originally was just to protect and preserve international peace and security. But what you've seen recently is them to try and take a more proactive approach. So rather than just reacting when a conflict occurs, to try and prevent conflict from taking place from the beginning. And what you see here is conflict prevention in 2005, the resolution on this recognised that sustainable development was a key part of conflict prevention. And so Germany and France argue that sustainable development obviously encapsulates climate, and therefore that should be included. And you see that really in the mandate where they ask the Secretary General to include his contextual information. That's really an area where this conflict prevention has come up. And the final thing is the security threat. And this is really pushed by the small island states. They say, you know, if it was one country being threatened, whose whole existence was being threatened by another, the Council would definitely be addressing it. So our very existence is threatened by sea level rise, so you should be addressing it too. And so you see them turning up frequently in the Council to push this. And the minister from the Marshall Islands made a really interesting point. He said, you know, I had to come before the Council 25, 30 years ago to get our independence, to get recognised by the UN as a state. Now our state is threatened and you don't want to talk about it. So that's a really interesting, you know, question of the UN has to approve statehood, so what should they be doing with states that are at risk of losing it? But despite that, there's been a lot of opposition, and most of it has been procedural. Most of it's come particularly from the G77 bloc of developing countries and from the non-aligned movement. And they argue basically that the Council really has no mandate to discuss climate. They say it's a sustainable development issue. It should be dealt with in the General Assembly, in the Economic and Social Council, and of course in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And these are the annual negotiations that you hear about, so the Kyoto Protocol is part of that, the Copenhagen Accord. And they say that's the venue, it already exists, it shouldn't be dealt with by the Security Council. And what really underlines this argument is fears about the fact that the Security Council only comprises 15 states, and 5 of them are permanent members who have a veto. The fact that they have this veto really worries a lot of developing countries, especially since they are some of the biggest greenhouse gas emitters. And I think the underlying fear is that this would enable them to escape their obligations, which they've not really been meeting very well under the Convention on Climate Change, and then force through an agreement through the Security Council without other states being able to participate. And then you have the related concerns that it's going to undermine other processes on climate and that it's going to overburden the Council. There are some conceptual arguments against the Council considering it, and Bolivia has said that securitization isn't appropriate, it's too oppositional, and this is an area where we want better cooperation. But I want to look at Pakistan very quickly. I know we're short on time, because they've really shifted their position. This is their statement in the first debate. So you can see there's very strong language highlighted. And in the second debate in 2011, in the second debate, you see a real shift in their language, that they've gone from, this is no place to, this is an important contribution. And then, of course, last month they ended up hosting it. So within the space of 6 years, they've completely changed from there's no role for the Council to we want to host a debate on this. And a number of reasons, and I won't go into them too much now, but I think it's largely that Pakistan's been feeling the climate impact. Everything that Greg talked about with Bangladesh, similar stuff has been happening in Pakistan. And so they feel this vulnerability, but they've also recognised, I feel, it's a political judgment, that they've noticed that there's this brutal arithmetic of climate change, as Nicholas Stern, who wrote the very famous report on the economics of climate change, that we're really failing to meet our emissions obligations. Things are only getting worse. And so they're holding out for a more equitable agreement, but I think they've realised that actually, as time goes by, the action that's going to be required from everyone is only going to get more. And so even though you might not get perfect equity now, it's probably going to be better than what you can get later on. So there's this recognition by a lot of countries of that reality. And so just to end, I think most countries still think the Framework Convention on Climate Change is the place for an agreement. And even the countries that have pushed it the most, the UK, France and Germany, have all been at pains to say, it's a subsidiary and complementary effort. Because what they're trying to do is they're trying to use the Council's teeth, the sanction power that the Council has, to really apply pressure on the UNFCCC, which, though it's a far more legitimate and an organisation and it has much better capacity to deal with climate change, that's where all the experts are, they lack a lot of sanction power. So they're trying to get these two institutions to work together and to get the Security Council to apply pressure. And so that's really my main conclusion from the research. And there's been a real process, particularly by the small island states, whereby the more they talk it up in all these other forums, not just the Security Council, there's an ongoing effort to maybe take it to the International Court of Justice. But by pushing this in all these other fora, what you have is they've actually, the term is rhetorical entrapment, they've forced a lot of states that otherwise wouldn't have done to talk up the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And so particularly the oil-producing states that really don't want any agreement, whenever the Security Council discusses it, they go, oh, well, we love the UNFCCC, we really want to have an agreement there. So what's going to happen is that then when we have those annual negotiations, they can be held to that rhetoric. They can say, look, you don't want it in the Security Council, fine. Now we've got to do something here. And so that's a really interesting thing. And whether or not that's going to be successful, you know, the one conclusion I think I can say pretty confidently is this is not going to be the last time the Security Council does address this issue.
Well, I really like a rhetorical entrapment. I'm definitely going to try to use that in the future. So if we could have Professor Saeed and Professor Conca and our three panelists come up, and we'd love to hear Professor Saeed and Professor Conca's reaction to the student work, and then we'll take some questions from the floor.
First time we've ever been on a panel together. Yes, I'm looking forward. Okay, well, thanks for putting the event on. I think this is a great thing to do, and I'm happy to have been invited to participate. So I'll comment on all three of the presentations. So first I'll put on my social movement hat and talk about Livia's presentation, and then I'll put on my, I don't know, two hats, green and security, and talk about the other two. So on the presentation about indigenism and social movements in Bolivia, that was quite interesting. I thought there's a couple of things that I wanted to pull out. I liked the emphasis on many different modes of observation, so the use of texts, the use of interviews, the use of ethnographic observation, I think that's quite commendable. The second thing that I really liked about it was the separating within the indigenous community of the, if we can say, the elite marginalized voices of the indigenous organizations and certain simpatico academics and so on, from what we say the sort of truly marginalized voices of kind of popular indigenous attitudes and so on. And that's really where I would focus many of my comments, because in some ways the differences there I thought were the most interesting aspect. The fact that that left-hand column had a certain kind of narrative that didn't play well with broader folks, 500 years. So in that sense, it's not surprising. Whereas some of the more subtle distinctions between elite indigenous social movement mobilizing and what you found to be more broad-based attitudes in society, I think is really interesting. So I'll just make maybe a couple of observations. One, this is an aside, and then I'll come back to that point, but I think it's important. Social movements generally have three different audiences at the same time, and this is one of the challenging things about sustaining a social movement. On the one hand, they have to rally the faithful, they have to speak to the people whom they are attempting to mobilize. And so the framings that are used, the discursive strategies that are used, one of the purposes of those is to actually mobilize people so that it is a movement rather than just isolated leaders with no sort of following. The second audience that movements speak to is the target, in this case the state, and in many cases the state. And there are often tensions between those two different voices that movements need to have, and it's a tricky thing to be an effective social movement and to speak effectively to both of those audiences. Often what you want to do with the faithful is really kind of, appeal to deep grievances and appeal to a shared sense of identity, maybe even a sort of a shared sense of otherness. Injustice is a very, very powerful frame. Often when you're speaking to the state, what you want to do is you want to position yourself right at the margin between institutional politics and extra-institutional politics. So we're right here. And if you meet our grievances, fine. But if not, we're going to go extra-institutional and, strikes and so on and so forth. And sometimes those are not sort of consistent. The thing that always interests me is that at the same time, movements speak to the rest of society, which is sort of on the sidelines, because movements can never prevail by themselves, even when they have 64% of the population. So the classic example is the civil rights movement in the United States, where you see it's an appeal to white northern liberals. At the same time, it's an attempt to mobilize African Americans and challenge, the oppressive state and so on and so forth. So one thing I'm curious about is how the discourses that you identified worked in that sort of third-party kind of context and in the broader set of alliances in Bolivian society that are going to be necessary for some of the political aims to be realized. The second thing, and this is really just a question, but I think it's a fascinating question, is I was really intrigued by the differences between the indigenous organization academics in their discourse and then what you found in the more sort of popular routes. And that suggests certain kinds of tensions. And while it's not as stark as the tension that you pulled out, why are people still protesting against AVO and the state? That's a cleavage that could widen as well. And yet, we do find still an enduring capacity of those indigenous organizations to mobilize popular dissent. Is that simply because the state is even worse, and this is the alternative that people have, is to work through those channels? Or are there also some elements of common ground in the discourse between the elite organizations and popular? I'd be curious, not knowing much about Bolivia. Okay, so other hat now, Greg and Joe. So starting with Greg's paper. So unpacking this question of climate change and terrorism, it seems to me the causal logic is really something like climate change causes bad things to happen, bad things can lead to violence, and violence may take the particular form of terrorism. And if we unpack it a little bit that way, I think there's some really interesting questions to pull out here. Climate change leads to bad things. Full stop. I agree. I think you made the case, both with regard to Bangladesh as a particularly vulnerable place and more generally. A lot of your analysis of how that in turn could create the conditions for violence was based on a model of violence as a response to grievances. And that is one of the schools of thought about where we get violence from grievance, right? But there's other schools of thought as well, and it's kind of interesting to try those on. So some people have argued that violence isn't really about grievances, it's really just about relative capabilities, that there are always going to be contenders for power, and if the state is weak and the contenders are relatively strong, then they may use violence to get their aims rather than other means to get their aims. And now more recently, we've been told by Collier and some of his ilk that it's really a resource competition. And the violence is almost sort of like organized crimes, right? Blood diamonds and resource conflicts and all those sorts of things. So there may be a connection between the bad things that happen in climate change and the violence that results. But it seems to me there's maybe more than one pathway by which that could occur. If it's the grievance pathway, certainly it seems like there's going to be a whole new list of grievances in a greenhouse world. The question then becomes, toward whom will those grievances be directed? And in this case, I think some of your points about state failure and state weakness and so on, because while it may not, in fact, be the state of Bangladesh that is primarily culpable for the climate-induced grievances that people end up having, it's sort of there, and its incapacity to respond and so on makes it as sort of a logical target. But when we talk specifically about terrorism, does that mean we should expect terrorism directed at the Bangladeshi state, or terrorism directed at other entities that are maybe seen as ultimately culpable for climate change? If it's not about grievances, but if it's about relative capabilities, one of the things that we're seeing is that the kinds of things you're talking about with climate change, they decrease the capabilities of many people to use violence. When we see out-migration, it's often the most capable people who migrate out, and it's the people who are least capable who kind of are forced to stay and suffer in place and so on. And so one of the reasons why I think we haven't seen a correlation between environmental degradation and civil war is because many of the people who have legitimate grievances also have radically decreased capabilities relative to the state. So they may not be able to use violence in that regard. So I think there's a really interesting sort of set of questions inside of that of what is the specific pathway that might connect sort of climate cause and violent outcome. I do think the state failure is a really key. So states that are increasingly seen as illegitimate because they can't respond to social needs and increasingly burdened with a whole new agenda of tasks to do is really the crux of the matter in many ways. But that then raises the question of terrorism targeted at whom and what forms of violence targeted at whom. The last observation I'll make, and I'll just throw this out there, is I was really intrigued that you had that little aside of the stuff you weren't going to talk about when you said that clashes of values and demographic transitions were not affected by climate change. But if you ask terrorism against whom or grievances against whom, pre-existing forms of identity cleavages in society are often the way, the paths along which violence flows whether that's an accurate statement of who the grievances should be targeted at or not. And so it seems to me that ultimately we do have to talk about clashes of values and the way that climate change may kind of overlay onto those. So it's fine for the purposes of the presentation, set aside, but I would encourage you to keep it in your analysis going forward. Joe, greening security or militarizing the environment, right? This is the big question, and we have to confront. So Joe knows this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart, and we spent a lot of time talking about this and kicking around ideas, and I'm interested in where he's going. So I'll just throw out a couple of questions. I was intrigued by this rhetorical entrapment concept, and I hadn't heard that from before. And that's really interesting, and I like it. I'm going to argue with it in a minute, but I do like it. Is the Security Council a legitimate body for dealing with this? Is a question that really, really has to be addressed. I think you're right that across the different periods, there's increasing legitimacy for the topic. And you don't have this early cognitive dissonance. Why are we talking about this? This is not a security issue. This is a development issue. But whether the council has the legitimacy to act upon this, I think, is not a trivial sort of question. And those G77 grievances are not simply venue shopping. The other question is, what would the council actually do on this? I think the rhetorical entrapment is an interesting mechanism, but there do seem to be people that actually want to use the council. And for now, it's fine to say, use the bully pulpit of the council. And there doesn't seem to be a bigger goal than keeping the council seized of the matter in Security Council parlance, right? But what's it going to do? Is it going to deal with the small island states question? Are we going to get a climate-related responsibility to protect? Is it going to deal with the peacekeeping missions? And is that primarily how it relates? And so the people who've been an advocate of the council discussing this are not really able to see beyond the question of seized of the matter. So my question would be, council remains seized of the matter toward what ultimate end? It's not yet been made obvious. And the last point I'll make, and then I'll stop because I know I've been going on, is rhetorical entrapment or rhetorical venue shopping. There's a lot of hypocrisy here, right? And so I think you're probably right that it does get countries on record as saying something about climate change for which they can later be held accountable. But it also creates another place where countries can kind of greenwash and show us sort of a false seriousness about the issue. So Susan Rice goes to the Security Council and she bangs on the table and she says, it's an abdication of our responsibility that we can't talk about this issue. And that's the same United States that abandoned the Kyoto process. China doesn't want to talk about it in the Security Council because it's a defender of the Kyoto process, and that's the only proper place to talk about it. But of course, at the Copenhagen Conference of the Parties, China was ready to throw the Kyoto process completely out the window if it could sign a side deal with the United States. So along with rhetorical entrapment, we may be getting a fragmentation of the conversation where countries can act serious in their preferred venue and avoid needing to do something serious in the other venues at the same time.
Professor Said.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Hearing and listening to your presentations, I took myself back to 1958 when the School of International Service was established. At that time, we defined international politics, relationships among states. Then we moved to set governments after 10, 15 years. And more recently, people, movements. In 1958, what you guys are talking about was not even discussed in textbooks. Hearing you, listening to you. Peace was defined as absence of violence. But listening to you and hearing you, looking at, you are telling us, hey, wait a little. Peace is deals with presence. It deals with ecological balance. And thank you very much for elaborating on that. Peace, in terms of, when we talk about ecological balance, we are talking about the physical environment. That peace also deals with human dignity, when we are talking about the human environment. That peace, when we talk about the cultural environment, is about cultural diversity. That when we talk about the political environment, it is political pluralism. If you had mentioned these things in 1958, we would have sent you to Looney House. I mean it. So sitting here, hearing you, my God, yeah, I read only the paper by Livia myself. Yeah. So Livia, one of the questions I have for you, what are the implications from your paper to other transitional societies? And when you talk about democracy, how are you using the term democracy? The way I was educated about democracy was in my studies. It was American democracy, Western liberal democracy. But reading your paper, it becomes clearer that democracy, we have to distinguish form from substance. That there are many forms of democracy. That the substance of democracy deals with participation, how do you participate? It deals with common objectives. It deals with safeguards. And also one of the questions to you, implications to other transitional societies. When you talk about Bolivia indigenous, what came to me when I read your paper, the term indigenous, I would use it also to apply to many Arab societies where really the ruling elite has very much been trained and educated in values different from their indigenous values. So democracy, it's a fragile flower. How does it grow? How does it grow? These are some of the questions that came to me also. But above all, I speak with the three of you with a great deal of pride, and pride in you, in what you are sharing with us here. And I will sit and answer questions and participate questions. Thank you.
So, Livia, Joe, and Greg, if you want to respond to any of the questions and comments that have been put forward.
Sure. Well, I'll pick and choose. I cannot address all of them, if that is okay with you. Well, first, I think, thank you, Professor Conca, for your comments. I would be happy to share my paper with you. Maybe you can get some insights. And I think especially your raising of the issue of the common ground between the elite indigenous movement people, also the spokesperson, so to say, and the people, the actually marginalized people who often are not heard, that I think is a very important issue. And what I had to think of when you were speaking would be the tipness movement that is continuing to go on. Right now there's a big movement around a natural park in the lowland area where that was designated as indigenous territory, but the Bolivian government wants to construct a highway through the middle of it, claiming that it will allow for development and access, but actually the indigenous communities say it will destroy the biodiversity and really harmfully affect the territory. And there you have the lowland indigenous communities who can rally and mobilize around the protection of the area against their government, where they get great support from the general population, which I think is very interesting, because when I talk to them, none of them identifies as indigenous per se, but instead what I see is definitely the common people's yearning for progress. They want to advance, they want change, and they see in those movements the last possibility for change often. At least that's how I saw them identify it. So when you have a movement go against something that the government wants, they see it as their opportunity to tag along and finally see the changes become effective that they wanted to see beforehand already. I also saw a great deal of anger. So whenever you can voice that anger, you use the opportunity. You don't even have to be part of the cause, but just rally with it and be loud and voice whatever you think is frustrating you. That voicing it is also a stark desire that I could identify. But at the same time, because there is not that identification with it, there's also conflict that people don't really understand what they're rallying for, which I think harms the effectiveness of the mobilizations, because the masses don't stand behind the goals that are actually trying to be achieved, but instead merely of the change that they think should be effective. So that I see a tension that will further exacerbate conflict, even if they are able to get the government more on board of the indigenous movement together at large. And for Professor Said, I think democracy, like you already basically answered your question, it's not about a system of democracy that I'm talking about, but it's more a form of government that allows the people to rule themselves, basically. It's a participatory system that tries to promote the well-being of all people, and there are different ways of doing so. And I find it very interesting that Bolivia, as this indigenous democracy, embraces the system of democracy as their desired form of government. So despite it being a Western concept in certain ways of it being realized, they don't think that the system itself is at fault, but it's the political ideology that was behind it before that made it not fit and unjust for the Bolivian people. But democracy itself, they also identify as the best system because it allows all people to come together and decide what is best for them. So for the other questions, I'm happy to talk to you afterwards, but
yeah, in the interest of time, Joe, love to hear, or Greg, sorry, we'd love to hear from you too.
Yeah, I would just like to thank both of you for sitting on the panel also, and really comments and your feedback. The point, I guess, as far as who the target would be directed against, we were talking about the state of Bangladesh, and then also kind of omitting clashes of values and demographic transition. The area where I kind of first got the idea for this project from, or this paper from, was we were sitting in Sakina's climate change class last semester watching a documentary on the Copenhagen climate talks, and listening to a lot of the representatives from the small island states or places like Bangladesh speak, the level kind of anger that they had, and hopelessness, and a lot of their blame towards the developed world, both for its historical contribution to the problem and its constant impediment in the way of progress, really reminded me of the same types of rhetoric I had seen in other places studying terrorism as an undergrad. So when we talk about clashes of values and potential targets, that's kind of the question I ended my paper with, is I was kind of just focusing on how the physical effects could possibly manifest themselves in a certain way in the developed world, but I think what's really interesting to think about moving forward also, if you know, the US, the EU, moving forward, China, if we're seen as the places that have caused a problem, that has ruined people's ways of life, and steadfastly, continually refused to allow the problem to be solved, I wonder if there is going to be hostility directed towards us in the future.
It just came to me. I meant to mention that earlier. Looking at terrorism, we are dealing more with the supply side of terrorism and not the demand side of terrorism. I mentioned that because I used to teach courses on terrorism way back in the 60s. And I was invited to the National War College to lecture on terrorism. And I spent one half of my presentation, those of you who have been at the War College, what they do, they give you like 30 minutes, a break, another 30 minutes. I spent the first 30 minutes talking about human rights. During the break, I overheard officers saying, this man must be a clown. He was invited to talk about terrorism, he talks about human rights. Now, my concern there was they were much more interested in the supply side, not the demand side. And have we dealt more with the demand side of terrorism in recent? I have not been involved in that literature. And how? What theories have we developed?
I still think the focus is on the supply side, but I'm a few years out. I don't know how that works out, so I don't know if things will be 4 or 5 years. But back then, it was mostly a supply side issue, which I think rightfully leaves out half the equation.
Yeah, that's my concern, because I also used to teach a course on drugs, and I have written on drugs back in the 60s, 70s. We have dealt with the supply side of drugs in the United States, but not the demand side, which takes much more time, much more effort, much more investment. Yeah.
Fascinating question. And Joe, some closing comments from you as well.
Hey, really quickly, and I'll just talk about this idea of what can the council actually do, because we can talk about the other stuff. That's really an area that I want to look at, is like what concrete and feasible actions can the council take. There were a few that have actually been brought up. Germany in 2011 really wanted them to appoint a special representative of the Secretary General for Climate and Security. That didn't happen, but that would be a fairly, obviously it's an office, it's a new office that you're creating more bureaucracy, but that would be a relatively easy step that they could take. But then what would they do? That's the next question. They also were talking, and this got a lot of media attention, this idea of having a green helmets peacekeeping force that could go in, particularly in instances of climate-induced conflict, that was specially trained to deal with that. You mentioned R2P, responsibility to protect, and that's interesting, right? How can should the two be linked? Would that work? But then there are other ones like linking the Security Council with the Kyoto Compliance Committee, or whatever succeeds the Kyoto Compliance Committee under a future agreement. Of course, that relies on the world agreeing binding emissions reduction targets, but then you could have like a link in, so you could use the Council's power there to add teeth to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And the other ideas are sort of reviving the Trusteeship Council that can sort of take responsibility either for the small island states again, or for as a trustee for the global commons. And so there are a lot of ideas there.
That's great.
Fascinating question.